else.
Yeah. Right. He gets all the short questions. Is the South China Sea an old-fashioned tinderbox? Is war bound to break out?
Well, look, I think South China reminds us that the possibility of major power conflict arising from seemingly small causes is very real. Years ago, this is about 5 or 6 years ago, one of the things I do at the journal is I oversee our global editorial pages. And we'd run an editorial that, in passing, had mentioned these islands I'd never heard of called the Senkaku Islands. And we described the Senkaku Islands as the disputed Senkaku Islands. I thought nothing of it when...
How fast did the Japanese embassy call you?
Within that morning, okay, so you know exactly, immediately, there was a senior Japanese diplomat. The Japanese are so polite as diplomatically, and they just insisted on a meeting right away. And they came in and they described the fact that these uninhabited rocks, not in the South, but in the East China Sea, just north of Taiwan, were not captured from China during the 1894 conquest of Taiwan, but had been, in fact, seized by the Japanese Navy as terra nullius, as, blank or whatever land, before the invasion of Taiwan, that they were undisputedly Japanese, that Melvin Laird, as Secretary of Defense under Richard Nixon, had returned the Senkaku Islands to the Japanese when Iwo Jima and Okinawa were returned. They went on and on about this, and I thought, God, these Japanese are such bizarre people. Going on and on about these uninhabited rocks in the middle of the ocean. Well, it very quickly became apparent that the Japanese were onto something, and I just didn't know what I was talking about. Not the first time. Because soon the Chinese were sending fishing boats, coast guards. They were declaring air defense identification zones over the Senkaku Islands. They were applying the same kind of tactics to first dispute the sovereignty of the islands, to controversialize it, and perhaps to gain a concession. And that's, of course, what they're doing in a bigger way in the South China, in South China Sea. Now, I mention all this because as this happened with the Japanese diplomats, I was reading Winston Churchill's History of the First World War. It's a wonderful history. And the history begins not in Sarajevo, but it really begins at a place called Agadir, which is a bay in Morocco, in southern Morocco. And in 1911, this uninhabited bay in southern Morocco was visited by a small German gunboat. And Churchill has this wonderful line in his memoir in which he says, all the alarm bells around Europe began to quiver. It's just such a wonderfully Churchillian, began to quiver. Why was that? The Germans sent this gunboat in. Wasn't clear what they wanted. Did they want a naval base on the North Atlantic? There was, of course, the naval contest with Britain hard underway. Did they want to contest France's effort to turn Morocco into a French protectorate or colony? Was there something else they wanted? What was going on? And World War I nearly started, not in 1914, but in 1911 over Agadir. So it was a reminder that great conflicts can be sparked at the pinky tip, if you will, of the world. And what's happening in these tiny little spits where a fundamental American interest, freedom of the seas, and a increasingly assertive Chinese claim, the South China Sea is our own lake, we own this thing, are coming into conflict. And they're coming into conflict in ways where the possibility of a small incident rapidly escalating into major conflict is immense. So the answer is, it is, and is war about to break out? I hope not.
So I would just add an anecdote and then a comment. The risk of something, I don't think that China's main objective right now, or the regime's main objective, is they want to stay in power, and they understand that economic growth is the way to do that. They do not want to destabilize the broader region at this point in time. So they aren't looking for conflict. and nor is the U.S. looking for conflict. That said, China is asserting its sovereignty claims very forcefully. And in the recent past, its military has, shall we say, engaged in some cowboy-like activity. One of my jobs when I was undersecretary is to raise some of these incidents with the Chinese. So in one case, we had to show them photographs of Chinese planes intercepting our fighters that were in international airspace, but the Chinese felt that it was Chinese airspace or too close. And they were coming within 10 feet, wingtip to wingtip. Anybody who is a pilot or an aviator here knows how dangerous that is. One mistaken move, poor piloting, and you have another P3 incident where you have a downing of an aircraft, international crisis, months of tension, and instability. Another one was buzzing over the bridges of our ships at very low altitude. And so they were doing some fairly dangerous thing. And this one all the way, they didn't listen to me, even though I showed them the pictures. It took Vice President Biden going and showing President Hu the pictures to say, will you please stop? This is not the way to behave. You're asking for a miscalculation, some accident that puts us into a conflictual situation. And I think since then, most of that activity has stopped. But the analogy I use, it's more like the boiling frog scenario, where as China feels more powerful, it seeks to assert its interpretation of its claims to disputed areas. And the disputes are with maybe 5, 6 different countries, not just Japan. We're not a party to these disputes. We don't pick the winners and losers, but we have a view about the rules of the road. We believe that international waterways should be international waterways, and there's freedom of navigation there. Same with the airspace. Huge amount of the world's commerce flows through that region. We believe that when there are disputes, they should be resolved peacefully through negotiation, not through coercion or military means by the more powerful power. But what China is starting to do, little by little, is create new facts on the ground. Massive land reclamation efforts to take these rocks and reefs and make them islands where they can plant a flag. Unilaterally declaring an air defense zone. So now international aviation has to basically say, Mother, may I, to the Chinese, alert the Chinese when flying through what they claim is their airspace. These are things that each thing by itself seems minor, and why would this be a basis for conflict? It's not. But if you have 10 years, 20 years of this over time, suddenly one day you wake up and you find yourself in Asia Pacific, the most important region to us economically in the future, and suddenly all the rules have changed. And it's now might makes right instead of international law makes right. That is not a future we want to allow to happen. So these small things seem like small things, but they have very big implications. And so I think the U.S. has to be present. We have to reinforce our partners and allies in their ability to defend their own territories and in the region. And we have to try to defend the international rules of the road that we architected after World War II. And that's really been the basis for incredible stability and prosperity in the region for decades.
I would only quibble with one thing you said. I mean, my great worry about China now isn't that it's getting stronger, it's that it's getting weaker. And since the death of Mao, the basis of legitimacy for the Communist Party in China has been 2 things. 1, economic prosperity, and 2, they represent the Chinese nation, right? It's a nationalism. Well, for 30 years or so, they kept the spigot of prosperity flowing quite nicely. That's changing, and it's changing very noticeably. I think China's economy is slowing much more sharply than the numbers indicate because there is a bias in the system to inflate their numbers. As their economy starts to contract, the need for the Communist Party to emphasize nationalism as a legitimizing pillar of its claim to rule is going to grow. And it's declining powers, actually, that are the most dangerous because they're desperate. And they think that through war, they can restore what they're losing by failing to manage their economies well or provide social benefits and so on. That's what really terrifies me about the China under Xi, that this is a guy who I think is overmatched by his economic problems and is going to be tempted in the way that the generals in Argentina were tempted to do something really very rash. On an optimistic note.
My questions, and then we'll turn it to the audience.
Okay.
Great.
Oh, great. See, we're agreeing again. Would the Trans-Pacific Partnership move American jobs overseas? Would it enhance America's influence throughout East Asia enough to justify that?
Right.